Welcome back, everyone. Hope everyone's ready for today's keynote presentation. Dave, Nowak, we worked out the technical difficulties and we are ready for the second half of this morning's presentations. For Dave's keynote session, he will talk about how urban forests are constantly changing and will face various threats in the coming years. This presentation will discuss various forces of change, projections of urban forest change, and 10 things that you can do to help urban forests become more relevant to society. Over to you, Dave. All right, he's getting his webcam started. All right, until Dave gets going here, we do have Dave's website in the question and answer box. And if we didn't get to your question, make sure that you put it back into the Q&A box, and we will get to it after the second presentation from 11:30 until noon. Hi, Dave. Perfect. Yeah.
Hi, Wendy. I'm not going to put my camera on because then he suggested maybe that's a bandwidth issue too that might cause it. Hopefully this will work well. Hopefully you can hear me. Hi, everybody. Hopefully you'll keep my fingers crossed on this one. Okay. So this presentation is more about thoughts about how things urban forests are facing in general, where we're headed into the future, and I have think at the end my top 10 things I think we need to do as an urban forestry community to help move urban forestry forward. But this presentation is mainly about where we're at and some of the changes we'll be facing in the coming years. As you all know, trees produce multiple benefits. There's a list of some of the ones that trees produce, and we've done various papers at national assessments, and if we look at just air quality, greenhouse gas reduction, energy conservation, that's just those three, again, being a conservative estimate, we estimate the U.S. forest produces over $18 billion per year in values just on those three, but you can see we haven't done many other ones related yet to water quality, social benefits, things like there's many things that we can't quantify yet. So conservatively, the forest produces many values and many benefits to society, which hopefully you all know about. We as urban forest, to understand how we assess urban forest values, basically structure, function, value. Structure is what is the forest itself. How many trees do we have, the cover, the species composition, their sizes, the physical attributes about the forest that you can measure, and those structural attributes affect the functions, air pollution, water, things like that, and they have values to society. So in order to optimize values for the future, we have to understand this relationship of how, if we change species, density of trees, their locations, how these functions and values will change in the future. The concept of management is that we want to optimize these values on the right-hand side, but we can only do that by manipulating structure, which means we can choose where to plant, what to plant, when to plant, what we remove, and we may choose some of this, or some of this may be forced upon us by outside events, insect and disease outbreaks, storms. So the structure is constantly changing. The goal of urban forest management is to try and move this structure forward in a proper fashion so that it's healthy and producing optimal benefits for society. However, we live in an environment that's constantly changing.
Dave, we seem to have lost your audio again. Can you hear us?
Can you hear me now? Yeah, sorry, disconnected again, but it came right back this time. The gods are with me for a second. All right, so basically, there are a lot of things that are going to be changing in the future, and that's what I want to talk about. This is where we're at. So let's talk about environment first. So basically, right now, approximately 137 million Americans, 42% of our country, lives in counties where air quality concentrations are above EPA standards. So we have polluted air. Globally, air pollution is the biggest environmental health threat to populations, particularly like in Asia and India. The air pollution is huge. In the U.S., air pollution concentrations, air quality has been getting better thanks to the EPA and actions we've been taking over the past 50 years. But a lot of people still live in areas that are in non-attainment for air quality. On top of that, in our city systems, we have a lot of areas that live in areas with poor water quality. 46% of U.S. stream length has high levels of phosphorus. 41% have high levels of nitrogen. So we have air pollution issues that we have to deal with. We have water quality issues we have to deal with. UV radiation has increased since the 1970s due to high concentration of chlorofluorocarbons in the atmosphere, breaking down the ozone layer. It is starting to stabilize, but we still have UV issues. The reason I show you all these, like air pollution, water, and UV, is trees affect all of these. So if we have pollution, how do we use trees to improve that? If we have water quality issues, how do we do trees to improve that? If we have UV radiation still causing issues like skin cancer and cataracts, how do we design our forests, again, the structure to manipulate the functions and values to reduce UV radiation loads? Interesting thing about UV radiation is tree leaves absorb about 96% of ultraviolet radiation, so shade is good. But how we design shade is very important, because if you think about it, if you put a tree in an open field on a sunny day and sat in the shadow of that tree, even though tree leaves absorb 96% of ultraviolet radiation, the actual reduction in UV sitting in the shadow of that tree is only around 50%. And you say, why would that be? The answer has to do with backscatter from the sky. So if you're sitting in an open field and you're in the shadow of the tree, you're still seeing a lot of blue sky, so UV can scatter off particles. And so if you can see blue, you're probably getting ultraviolet radiation. So if you move into an interior of a stand where the sky is covered, you're getting pretty much 100% reduction in UV radiation. And this is important to understand in terms of designs about how we deal with schools and maybe school kids being exposed to, and people outside being exposed to ultraviolet radiation. So we have those things changing. We also have issues of climate change. Here's changes in temperatures relative to the 1901 to 1960 average. You can see average annual temperatures, land and ocean temperatures will tend to be rising. They're projected to rise even more depending on the scenario, the RCP scenarios that we're using. So we're going to have warmer temperatures on average going into the future. We're also going to have changes in precipitation. Some areas will get wetter, some areas will get drier, but also changes in heavy precipitation events. What this graphic shows you, the number of days of heavy events of precipitation. And I think this is going to be the biggest issues is in terms of climate change. So not only is pollution and water quality changing and things like this, but the issues with the changes in precipitation, and it's not going to be the gradual change of precipitation. I think that's going to be an issue for urban forestry management, or the gradual change in temperature. It's going to be the extreme changes during short periods of events that we're going to have to deal with. Hurricane intensities, increased storm events, increased rainfall events where all the rain comes in a very short period of time, increased drought. So it's these episodic events of intensity that are going to be harder to deal with, I think, in urban forestry in the long run than the gradual changes. But how do we deal with these storms and floods and heat waves and droughts that are going to may be affecting the urban forest? And it's going to be very important to how we manage that forest in the future to keep it healthy. So we have changes in heavy precipitation, sea level rises, extreme heat, decreased water availability as we go into the future, and it's going to vary depending on your location. So the environment's going to be changing. So if the environment is changing, we can't be doing the same thing we've been doing in the past and going with the past paradigms. We have to think about how we're moving into the future and what are the best designs and best species to create healthy and sustainable urban forests in the future, given that many facets of our environment are changing. On top of that, the gradual changes or increases in temperature globally is that we have heat islands. So we are creating an environment in which we were putting impervious surfaces down, producing heat through heating our buildings or putting energy in our buildings and automobiles running. So we create these heat islands where urban areas tend to be warmer than the rural areas. Because we have more impervious surfaces that absorb the radiation and store it longer, we lose evaporation because we have less trees that are pumping the water out. So we tend to get increased air temperatures in cities and in the range of 1 to 6 degrees centigrade. And you can see on this graphic here, those are just surface temperatures. And so we're producing a warmer environment. On top of that, we have climate change going on, so we're getting basically a double whammy going on. We have heat islands that are producing 1 to 6 degree centigrade changes in temperatures. Climate change, throw another 2 to 4 degrees centigrade on top of that. So we're going to have warmer environments to deal with. And then on top of that, we also have changes in precipitation depending on where you are. It's either going to get wetter for the most case in the United States or drier in certain areas. How are we going to deal with the structure of our forest to sustain that forest health into the future? So we have the environment change, and trees affect the environment. So we have to understand that not only, there's two things about this when we talk about urban forestry. The environment's going to be changing. The atmosphere is changing. How do the trees affect the atmosphere and improve human health in the city? And how do we sustain healthy tree populations in the future, given that the environment is going to change, whether it's going to get wetter, or drier, and warmer? So there's two parts. We want the trees to survive, which is an issue. We also want the trees to produce the services to offset the problems that are caused through urbanization and other artifacts. So that's one attribute. Now we have landscape change. Landscape is changing. It always has changed. So what I'm going to show you here is the patterns in the United States, and then I'm going to show you projections of where we're likely to go over the next 50 years. So this is the projected growth in urban land by percent of the county classified as urban. So on the x-axis, my pointer going here, this in 1990 was a county that had less than 0 to 1% urban land. In 1990 only grew by less than a fraction of 1% during that 10-year period. As you see, as we move across the counties that were 15 to 20% urban land in 1990, they grew by almost 4% over that 10-year period. Counties that were 50 to 60% urban grew by almost 8%. So what's important to show here is, the slope. Counties tend to move, as we move from low urban land to more urban land, the growth rate tends to increase. And this is an important consideration because we tend to always move to the right on these graphs. Some cases we lose urban land, for most cases we gain urban land. And as we do so, we tend to gain more urban land at a greater and greater rate until we reach around counties that are around 50, 60, 70% urban. They stabilize at around an 8% growth rate per decade. And after we get over 80%, the growth rates drop because we've pretty much used up all the land that we can use. So what we're having is what happens is as we have more and more urban land, we have more and more urban edge. So where do we develop? We tend to develop on the edge, and we just move the infrastructure out farther. So if you move a very large area out 1 mile versus a very small area out 1 mile, that large area consumes a lot more land base. And that's the pattern that we had in the 1990s. And urban land, as you know, we're defining it here, is based on census, and it is based on areas that have population density of about 500 people or more per square mile. So that was the pattern in the 1990s. So we saw this increasing pattern growth, stabilizing near 40 to 50, 60% range and decreasing down. In 2008 or so, we had that depression. The question was, did the same type of pattern hold during the 2000s to 2010? So we looked at that again, and that's these red dots. So the pattern was fairly similar, even though we had that depression, or if you will, a recession in the late 2000s. What we found is that the growth rates in the smaller counties were slightly lower. The growth rates in the more urbanized counties were slightly higher. So what we did for our projections, I'm going to show you going forward, we took the average of the 20-year decadal change to try and project forward what would this country look like if we sustained the growth rates that we've had over the past 20 years from 1990 to 2000. So we produced these maps. This is actual data. This is what the percent of the county area classified as urban land. I'm going to show the whole United States, and then I will zoom in on Ohio next so you can see your state. If you look at, if it's a white county, it is less than 5% of that county is classified as urban. And as you move more into the blues and the purples and the pinks, and finally up to the reds, if you get to a bright red county, which we see around Chicago, New York, Atlanta, and Los Angeles, over 80% of that land area is already classified as urban. Those are the most heavily urbanized areas. So that's what it was in the year 2000. 3.1% of the U.S. was classified as urban. 2010, same graphic. I'm going to show you this moving forward. This is actual data. This is 2010. We are at 3.6%. So we went from 3.1 to 3.6. Now what I'm going to show you is 2020 to 2060, based on the projection of that graph I just showed you, the 20-year moving average. So watch what happens in the United States over the next 50 years. So this is 2010, we're at 3.6. 2020, we go to 4.3. 2030, we go to 5.2. 2040, we go to 6.2. 2050, we go to 7.3. And 2060, we go to 8.6. So look what happened into the Atlanta area, the North Carolinas, the Baltimore to Washington corridor. And what's interesting to note here, and Florida also, and even around Cleveland, what's interesting to note here is we're not seeing cities pop up in the middle of nowhere. We're not starting new cities and say, oh, let's just start in the middle of North Dakota and produce something. We're building off the fringe that we already have. So the areas that are the most urbanized now are going to become hyper-urbanized, that region, over the next year, because we have that infrastructure to build upon. As we move across the landscape, unless things change, we follow the patterns of the last 20 years. We just keep building outward, and we're consuming more and more land. So this is the actual net change in that 50-year period. And what's interesting to note is, I get that little arrow popping up again. Oh, there it is. If you look around Atlanta and somewhat around New York City and even Chicago, we're starting to get donut hole effects. Atlanta's so urbanized, it's not going to have much growth. In the core of Atlanta, you're going to get the fringe that's going to be developing outward because Atlanta's already developed. So we're just spreading outward across the landscape from these major urban centers as we suburbanize and urbanize the areas around these cities. So let's show you Ohio. It's the same type of graphic. This is Ohio in 2010. Your state is classified in 2010 as 10.8% urban land. Same color graphics. White are counties less than 5%, and the red is counties with greater than 80% urban land. So here's 2010. You're at 10.8. 2020, you jump to 12.8. 30, you jump to 15.1. 40, you jump to 17.6. 50, you jump to 20.4. And 60, you're going to jump to 23.6. So you're going to double the amount of urban land if we keep the same projections going forward. Doesn't mean this will happen. It probably is likely going to happen given the patterns unless some sort of things change. And I mean, who knows with the virus, the coronavirus right now, with people moving away, like in New York, they're tending to move out of the city into the more rural lands and getting away from these concentrated areas. There's arguments that maybe it would be less. There's also argument it might even accelerate the growth rates because people are going to spread out to try and decentralize with this virus and expand out into more areas to decrease the population densities. So it'll be interesting to see how this is not a corona at all. Interesting to see how this plays out, but given the patterns in the past, we can expect there will be more development and more urban land. What this means is we are going to have more urban forests in the future at the expense of rural landscapes. So ag land is going to be converting to urban as our forested stands. So urban forests are going to become more important in the future because urban land is going to be consuming more and more of the land base of the United States and even globally. So here are the differences for Ohio, same type of thing. So these counties that are in the dark brown have greater than 25% of the land area are going to be converted from rural to urban land. So Ohio is going to move from 2.8 million acres in urban in 2010 to 3.4 million acres in 3.4 million acre increase between 2010 and 2060. So you can see around the Cleveland area and around, that's my geography, I think that's Cincinnati in the lower corner. So what does that mean for the United States? We're going to add about 2 million acres of urban land per year. Putting that in context, Delaware is only about 1.2 million acres. So we're converting a lot of rural land into urban as we expand outward. We're going to move from 3.6 to 8.6 over the next 50 years, which is an increase greater than the size of Montana. Population, approximately 90% of the U.S. population will be in urban areas by 2060. And you can see Ohio is going to go from 2.8 million to 6.2 million by 2060. So we're going to have an expanse of urban land. So the environment is changing. On top of that, we're creating more heat islands, moving out across the landscape, and creating more urban land as the population grows. The people have to go somewhere. If the population is going to increase, we're either going to densify our cities and put more and more people in the same space, or we move out across the landscape. And that's something that Corona might affect coming up in the coming years as we try to maybe de-densify. We have work that we're doing on trying to look at what does this mean for tree cover. So this is unpublished preliminary work, but we basically took that projection and looked at what the cover are in the counties. It's a complicated process, but we tried to look at what's going to happen to urban tree cover versus rural tree cover in the United States due to this growing urbanization moving from 3.6 to 8.6 land. And what we project out is that urban tree cover is actually going to increase by 5.9 million acres per decade over the next 50 years versus while rural tree cover is going to drop 11.3. So net, we're going to lose about 5 million acres of tree cover. So basically, we're going to be converting rural forested lands or rural agricultural lands to urban. So urban forest by default, because they're getting bigger, cover is going to go up. Doesn't mean the percent tree cover is going to go up. It just means the absolute amount of tree cover in urban land is going to be greater. We're going to have more and more people and more urban forests because we have more and more urban land. So we're going to increase urban tree cover at the expense, nationally, we're going to lose tree cover over the next 50 years. So that's the expense. So we have the environment changing, we have landscape changing. Now what we're trying to look at is what's been happening within our cities to tree and impervious cover. So forget the expansion that we just talked about, which is an issue in of itself, but let's say in the city of Cleveland, in the city of Cincinnati, or Dayton, wherever you're going to be, what's been happening to tree cover in our urbanized areas. So there's three approaches I'm going to show you. I'm going to show you global data, then I'm going to show you national data, then I'm going to show you some select data from cities on change. So if you think about it, which do you think? Is tree cover going up or going down? The answer is, for the most part, it is going down, but not always. And we'll show you some cases where it actually went up. So in this first study, which we published earlier this year, we looked at global urban tree cover change using satellite-defined urban areas, which is different than the census-defined urban areas, which is 500 people per square mile based on census data. This is satellite saying this is where a lot of impervious covers are. So this is more the hyper or more intensive urbanized areas where satellites pick it up. We put down over 7,000 points on photographs in the years around 2012 to 2017 and tried to look at how are the tree cover changing. So I'm going to go back one slide just to show you. We basically look at a point. Again, we look at a point at a previous image, and then we would jump to a future image or a later image, look at the exact same point and see if the cover class has changed. So in this case, it would have changed from tree, in this case, to lawn. And so you could have trees coming in, you have trees going out, buildings changes. That's this basic process of how we monitor changes by looking at random samples of points and see how those points change through time. So we did the whole world. Just to give you an idea where urban land is in the world, Asia has most of the urban land, 41%. Europe has 28%. North America has 17%. So most of the urban land is in Asia and Europe. You can see that this is percent urban land. So Europe has the greatest percent urban land. Almost 3% of Europe is classified as urban, even though China has the most urban land. I'm sorry, Asia has the most urban land. Asia is huge, only less than 1%, about 1% of that land is classified as urban. So you can see how urban land is distributed. On average, only about less than 1% of the world is classified as urban land based on satellites. One of the things we want to look at is how does, and this is important to understand that even in the United States, we tried to look at this globally also, is how does ecoregion affect tree cover? Is urban tree cover greater in forested regions or grassland regions or more desert regions, if you will? And what we found is similar to what we found in the United States. On average, globally, urban tree cover within cities developed in forests is 30.4%. Cities developed in grasslands is 18.2%, and cities developed in deserts is around 12%. Similar pattern to the United States. I think we have slightly higher numbers, but our definition of urban is different. But so where you have your city tends to dominate how much tree cover you have. The question is, why would that be? Well, the reason is it has to do with water and has to do with forest. I mean, where do people tend to reside? They tend to reside in areas that have water. Over 80% of the U.S., around 80% of the U.S., and around 75% of the world lives in forested regions because people need water. And what do trees need? They also need water. So if you have most of our people living in forested regions where there's ample water, ample resources for the trees to grow. There's seed sources and there's water, so we tend to have greater tree cover in areas with forests because we tend to have more water. So there's the proportion. On average, 75% of the U.S. lives in forested regions. In Europe, 91% of the people live in forested regions, heavily forested. In Australia, it's 81%. North America, only 78% of the population. In the U.S., it's around 80% live in forested regions. So most of our cities, most of our people live within forested regions. So here's the changes, percent tree cover in the globe. On average, 26.5% is the average percent tree cover globally. North America has the highest at 31.1%, followed by Europe at 30%, and Africa has the lowest at around 19% tree cover. How has the tree cover changed between 2012 and 2017? Every continent went down except for Europe. Europe actually had a slight increase in tree cover over that 5-year period. Most of the continents had slight decreases. Africa actually had the greatest decrease, a statistically significant decrease of a loss of 1.5% tree cover over that 5-year period. Global average is statistically significant. We're losing about 0.2% over that 5-year period. So tree cover is going down globally, although you can see in some areas it's going up. Impervious cover on the other side averages 25.9%. You can see the differences. Europe has the lowest percent impervious cover. But while tree cover is slightly going down, impervious cover is pretty much going up across the globe. As we expand out or develop our city areas, we tend to put more and more impervious cover down. This feeds back to another problem. If we're talking about heat islands and lack of water infiltrating into the soils because of impervious surfaces, we have this double-edged effect going on in some ways that as we develop our cities more and more, we're putting more and more impervious surfaces down, which cause temperatures to rise and change the water cycles. At the same time, we're taking trees out, which cause temperatures to rise and change the water cycle. So we have to find this balance because we're tending to increase impervious cover globally at a greater rate, and we're also losing tree cover globally. It's a double-edged effect in terms of they're both causing problems, the loss of tree and the increase in impervious cover. Next study we looked at was 2009 to 2014 is state by state. We tried to look at how is urban tree cover changing. And what we found is that in the United States, 43 of the 50 states had decline in tree cover, 24 had statistically significant declines, and the average tree cover globe, the United States urban tree cover went from 40.4% down to 39.4%, a loss of 1%, which is statistically significant. On the graphic, you can look at if it has a hashed mark on it, they were statistically significant, and pretty much if they're not blue, those are the states that were declining, or some of the other states had no change, but the blue states actually had increases in tree cover, which were Hawaii, South Dakota, and Wyoming. The other ones that had increases. They weren't statistically significant. But we're finding that almost across the United States, every area, urban area, is losing tree cover. Some are losing a lot more than others. That equates to about a loss of 28 million trees per year, or 138,000 acres of tree cover per year. In Ohio, tree cover went from 39% tree cover down to 37.6%. So Ohio is losing tree cover. So not only is the environment changing, but the structure of the forest is changing, and they're sort of counterbalanced. The environment might be getting, in most cases, getting warmer and worse in some cases, while tree cover is going down. Same thing happened related to impervious cover, same type of graphic. In this case, 48 states had increases in impervious cover, 23 had statistically significant increases. Ohio went up from 22.7 to 24.1% tree cover. Same type of graphic. If it has hash marks, there were statistically significant increases, and the darker the colors, the more the increase in impervious covers. So we have a similar problem that's going on globally in the states, is that tree cover is going down and impervious covers are going up. Lastly, I'm going to show you changes at the city scale. These are some cities that we looked at. I just scanning. I don't think we did any in Ohio. And this is the first study we did. We basically started with the city study. So okay, learn what's happening at the nation and what's happening at the globe. But what we looked at is these cities. I think there were like 20 cities here, and we looked at photos, and you can see the years. Like Albuquerque, the first year we looked at was 2006. The second year we looked at was 2009. We're trying to ask the question: is tree cover going up or going down? And what we found here is 17 of the 20 cities that we first looked at had statistically significant declines in tree cover. So the dark blue is the cover in the first year, and dark green is the cover in the first year, and the light green is the cover in the second year. All the cities went down. 2 of the cities we targeted specifically, so they're really not fair comparisons, but I'll show you them. One is New Orleans, which is right here. That we were trying to target is the effects of Katrina. So New Orleans lost about 1/3 of its existing canopy cover due to that, pretty much due to that storm. So that was a targeted one. It wasn't picked at random. The other one we tried to target was Detroit. And it was interesting. We were trying to look at, could we pick up an impact of emerald ash borer in Detroit, which was going through that area. And the interesting thing about Detroit is Detroit actually had a lower than average loss in tree cover. The question was why, if emerald ash borer is going through and you're losing all these trees, is cover not going down as much as other cities are finding, exclusive of New Orleans? And the answer lies partly in we believe, in the solution that we found here, which is Syracuse is the only city that tree cover went up in. So why did tree cover go up in Syracuse and the other cities it did not, and why did Detroit's numbers not go down as much as we would have expected because of emerald ash borer? The answer lies in natural regeneration. What happened in Syracuse just prior, late 1990s, we had a storm of derecho came through and took out a lot of our canopy, which opened up a lot of space. That on top of a poor economy means we're not developing the space, means a lot of natural regeneration coming in the city of Syracuse. So our cover went up, not by design, but by happenstance of a bad economy and a lot of open space being opened up due to the storms. So it may not be the forest that we would plant, but we're getting a lot of buckthorn coming in, invasive plants. We're getting a lot of pioneer species, ash, box elder, ailanthus. So the pioneer forest will naturally regenerate. And this is an important point about change, that we don't necessarily have to plan our way out of this. Nature will seek a balance. So there are 4 reasons why tree cover differs across the world or in your region. One is water. If you don't have water, you're not going to have as many trees. So desert regions tend to have fewer trees because you have to import the water in for the trees to survive. 2 is the amount of impervious cover that you have. If you have a lot of impervious cover in your city, you're not going to have a lot of tree cover because it's really hard for a tree to regenerate on top of a roadway. So that limits the space that trees can regenerate. 3rd is if you move away from that, with the remaining space that's non-impervious is grass and soil areas. Why don't we have more trees in those areas? The answer is it's humans. We tend to mow those areas. So as we're mowing our lawn, we're wondering why we don't have more trees. The answer is because we're mowing our lawns. If you stop mowing, and I know here in Syracuse, man, I get tons of regeneration occurring in my lawn. And that will naturally occur, but we tend to try to manipulate the landscape through mowing, so we're preventing it. The 4th factor is how many trees are being planted, how we're designing and managing our landscape to enhance the tree cover. But as this shows, natural regeneration is a huge influence in terms of populations. The same thing probably happened in Detroit, is that even though Detroit was losing ash, Detroit also had a poor economy. And so there's a lot of space that weren't being maintained anymore. So if you have these vacant areas and you do nothing in a forest region, they will regenerate. The forests are coming back. Even though we're losing ash trees, the forests were coming back, and it wasn't as much of a loss as we would have expected. Same cities, impervious cover, same story. This is the impervious cover in year 1, impervious cover in year 2. Pretty much every city went up in impervious cover in the United States. So we're having the same issue that everybody's having. Impervious cover increasing, tree cover tending to go down. So 17 cities had a decrease, 16 cities had increases in impervious cover. So our landscape is changing no matter where you are. Some cities might have increases in tree cover for various reasons, but for the most part, we are seeing decreases. If you want to know more about your local tree cover changes, in iTree there's a tool called Canopy. You can use Google Images to assess in a fairly short period of time how your city has changed in the past. So if we talk about urban forest change, basically there's two directions that tree cover can go. It's not going to stay the same. It can either go up or it can go down. But there are various reasons why, if you understand these reasons, why it's changing, we can maybe affect how it will change in the future. So if you think about it, there's patterns that will, or factors that will cause tree cover to go up, and factors that will cause tree cover to go down. And some are caused by nature, and some are caused by humans. So this is the list that I came up with. It may not be comprehensive. You may have different ones, but I'm going to show you what I think are the driving factors. And obviously, you think about increases in tree cover, number one thing that people are going to say is tree planting, and that's true. The one on the nature side is natural regeneration. So we have, we can plant trees as humans to increase tree cover. We can facilitate regeneration, which means we can stop mowing, which will allow natural regeneration to occur. We change tree cover by our species selection. If we plant invasive species, it might enhance, not that it's a good thing, it might enhance the tree cover in the future. Our maintenance can enhance tree cover, and climate change may actually lead to increases in tree cover. On the natural side, we have natural regeneration. But what causes trees to go down? Tree removals. We choose to remove, whether it be for development, for safety reasons, for old age. Mowing prevents tree cover. Pruning reduces tree cover. Development, vandalism, pollution can reduce tree cover. Climate change might do it. Importing of insects and diseases, a whole bunch of factors that we either directly or indirectly are causing changes in tree cover. And trees don't live forever, but there's a lot of natural factors that are going to cause that canopy to go down. Insects and diseases, old age, fire, storms, and drought. So we have all these factors that are constantly forcing the urban forest to change. So if we understand that, we can try and direct that structure of the forest to be the structure that we want it to be. If we do nothing, it's still going to change. It's going to go in its direction. The idea of management is trying to force it in the direction that we want it to be, which is hopefully enhancing services for the future population. So what percent of the urban forest is planted? People tend to think that it's urban, it must be dominated by humans. The fact of the matter is we do not dominate the landscape in the United States anyways, and into Canada. Only about 1 in 3 trees are planted in our cities. 2 in 3 come from natural regeneration. It's a huge forest, and if you think about it, depending on where you're at, if you're in a residential area, I think the numbers are 3 and 4 trees are being planted because it's a highly maintained system. So we're dominating that. But only about half the city is residential. Most of the city is not. So in these vacant areas, and seeing most of the cities are found in forested regions, we have a lot of natural regeneration going on, particularly in the forested regions. Not so much in areas of the desert like Phoenix and things like that. But in Ohio, you have generation. So it's a force that you can use to create canopy cover. So the urban forest is changing. It's moving. It's going to expand. The environment's going to change. We have all sorts of forces that are causing these change. So what do we need to do to help create better urban forests in the future? So I came up with my my top 10, which was funnier when Dave Lemon was still on, but it's not so good right now. But I call these urban forest challenges or opportunities. And these are my top 10 things that I think we need to do as an urban forestry community to help promote healthier urban forests going into the future and more sustainable urban forests. Top 10 considerations. Number 10, systems approach or regional approach. We don't necessarily need to be focusing, and not that it's not important to focus on the tree, we need to take a broader landscape view. As you can see, there's so many complexities of this urban-rural interface, and the interface as urbanization expands across the landscape. It's not just a question about the street trees along the roadways. It's a question about how does this urban center, let's say it's Cleveland or Cincinnati or wherever, interact with the surrounding agricultural areas. We need to take a larger expanse of the urban forest, particularly in lieu that the urban forests are going to expand out into the future and change the environment, which is not only going to affect urban landscapes, it's going to affect rural landscapes, it's going to affect forestry, it's going to affect agriculture. We need to broaden our view away from single trees, again, not that it's not important to maintain the single trees, to a larger landscape view to understand how this urbanization is going to impact our society in the coming years. Number 9, we need data. We need to measure and analyze, which we've been good, particularly in the last 20 or 30 years. We are getting more and more data. With data, we can actually have informed discussions about the value of the forest. Instead of saying we know trees are good, we can now say trees are this good and this is how many trees we do have. And it's more about, we need to move beyond just public trees, but the whole urban forest. Most of the forest is not on public property. Most of the forest is probably on private property. So we need more and more data to make arguments to the people that set policies about how we want this forest to be. It's not that we have to necessarily have more forests or less forests, but have informed discussions about where we want that forest to be in the coming years. So again, back to this graphic, measurement is critical because structure drives everything. If you don't know your structure, you can't say anything about the value of that forest. So first step is to measure the structure of that forest. Whether it be a street inventory or a sampling protocol for the whole forest, you have to have information about the structure. You can do it from the field. We have more and more better cover maps coming out, whether from LiDAR. This is a LiDAR image of Syracuse, of the tree heights and the tree distribution of buildings. It's a neat way to display graphic information on forest distribution. It doesn't necessarily give you species information, but it can give you height information and distribution of trees. It's getting this information out about structure to the people that make decisions about the structure and set the policies about structure. And you probably all know about iTree. That's partly what the main reason why we built iTree is to help people do this. iTree does not, it's outside of landscape, which has cover data already into it. iTree does not give you the data of your local forest, but it gives you the means to collect the data on your local forest, hopefully in simple means, and then assess those ecosystem services. So if you haven't tried it out, we encourage that. Number 8, data standardization. If we're collecting all this data, and we are collecting data, so maybe Cincinnati's collecting data one way, but Cleveland's collecting data another way, and then Dayton is another way. And how do we cross-compare if we're just, I mean, with computer systems now, this is probably my bias coming from iTree, having to deal with this, and even being with the forest inventory, everybody has different codes for species. Why can't we come up with a universal language besides the scientific code, which is the universal language of identifying a tree species, but we have codes. Sometimes people code Norway maple as number 1. Sometimes they code it as NOMA, Norway maple. Sometimes they code it as ACPL, Acer platanoides. So when we try to communicate data, because we're getting more and more data, it's like the old phone systems that we couldn't communicate. Why can't we come up with a system where we have a standard protocol to be able to communicate and talk so people across areas can cross-compare and set goals and standards and do it easily by just getting together and setting these standards? That's number 8. The ability, if we can set standards and we have standard data sets, we can make comparisons among cities. This is species richness. You can see urban areas tend to be have higher richness than the average forest in the eastern United States, which is about 26 species. Most cities have, in this case all cities showing, have more species than the natural forest. We can start looking at that. You know, start looking at change. This is diversity indices. So that area between 1.7 and 3.1 is the species diversity of eastern forest. Most urban areas are more diverse than the rural forests, at least in the eastern United States. So we can start making comparisons among cities and have discussions among cities if we're all talking the same language and have the same data sets to compare. Number 7, sorry. Which reiterates what my first talk was about, is time. We need to look to the future. It's not about what we have now. It's about where we're going and where we want to be. And projecting forward this stuff we just talked about, urbanization, where is our tree cover going? Our management plans are designed to move us forward, so it's not about the issues of today, although those are important because you have to deal with them day to day, but it's also about the issues that are coming down the road. They're not even here yet. We need to start having more and more of those discussions about where are we going and what are the issues. And that's what we talked about earlier in this presentation. We have climate change, development, pests, invasive plants, storms, fires, all these things going on, social inequity, that have affected the forest, will affect the forest, and they'll affect them in different degrees in the coming years. The storms of the past are not going to be the storms of the future. The fires of the past, as you can see, particularly out west, are not the fires that are today and coming into the future. The development patterns are changing. So we can't be talking about old patterns. We need to talk about the future patterns. So, and also, how are species going to shift under climate change? So we have, and how do we help facilitate that? So, when do we start making the species shift? So if in this case, black locust is going to do better farther north, when do we start either moving more towards, not necessarily black locust, but move more towards different species and less towards current species because the climate is going to change? This leads to this issue of trying to deal with native landscapes. The discussion of native landscape might be irrelevant 50 years from now, because what the native landscape was 100 years ago will not survive likely in the future climates that we're going to have. So trying to create native landscapes from the 1800s, early 1900s, although admirable, might be confounded by this climate change. And where are we going? We can't be looking always to the past, but looking to the future of where we need to be, given that things are changing. We need to optimize the urban forest through time. Good sites for trees, the right tree in the right spot, given the survival rates and the health of the trees. What are the ecosystem services that we desire from the urban forest in the coming years, given that we're going to be warmer and possibly wetter with maybe different pollution loads? And what are our planting rates that we need to put in now to sustain optimal cover through the future? The mathematics of this basically show if you want to have sustainable forests, you need to have sustainable rates of influx of trees. It's not about what you need, I don't know if you need to avoid, but you probably should avoid are big influxes of trees at one point in time. So let's say you have a forest that has 1 million trees and you have a 1 million tree campaign to plant another 1 million trees in the next 5 years. You've doubled your forest. If you now have an age class that's very young, which is like the baby boom generation coming through, that all those trees, half your forest in that example, is going to grow old together and is going to need welfare 50 years from now, and then it's going to crash and go away because it's going to reach the end of its lifespan. That would enhance canopy cover, but not really in a sustainable rate because you're going to be riding a wave function. The forest is going to go up very high, then it's going to go down very fast because all those trees are going to die at the same time. Sustainability is keeping an even keel of flux of trees coming in at an annual rate, which will stabilize the forest at a point in the future. Of course, it's easier said than done because there are many forces that will wipe the forest out in a hurry, such as a hurricane or an insect and disease that knocks out a proportion of the forest. Then you've got to reset the clock. So it's always about constantly adjusting and looking to the future and trying to stabilize this forest. Going through with time number 6, long-term management plans. We need not to manage, and not that we are in many cases, but in some cases flying by the seat of our pants and just doing what we're doing. It's nice to have a plan about where we want to be. You have your current state of your forest. What do you want the future to be? And develop plans to get there. Looking at what your social and environmental goals are and develop the plans to get there. Where do you want to be 50 years from now? And come up with a plan and try to implement that plan. So it works in this type of fashion. Step 1 is in the top there, you collect data on your area, which gives you your current state. You can't start any management plan without knowing where you're at. It's like trying to manage a grocery store without knowing what's on your shelves. You can do it and say, I'm going to buy 6 cans of soup and hope that's what I need, but it doesn't make any sense. The first thing is take stock of what you have. Once you have that information on what's on your shelves, or if you will, the stock of your forest, then you can start making management options, getting the public involved, looking at what species you want to have, and from that public involvement with the data, you develop a specific management plan, and if you implement that, that'll help to direct you to a future. If you do nothing, you will still get to the future, but it might not be the way you want it to be. So planning can help, especially with everything changing. We want to try to design forests that will help mitigate some of those changes and improve human health and well-being. Number 5, I think we need more monitoring. What we were saying in my last presentation about looking at mortality rates and how long trees are going to live, we just don't have the data because we haven't been monitoring. We know we have trees, and we know they die, but how long do they live and under which conditions do they live longer, and which species do better? But monitoring becomes very important in this in terms of monitoring change, rates of change, and you can, through monitoring, you can verify if your management plans are still working. We are starting to get more and more monitoring. iTree is now, my unit's been taken over by Urban Forest Inventory and Analysis, Urban FIA, and they are partnering with cities to set up permanent plots within the cities. We finished Austin and Houston and are finishing up the report for San Diego right now, but you can see on this list cities with the darker, bolder colors, and the year after are the years that FIA is involved with collecting and monitoring data. So in the next several years, we will have long-term data for these cities and monitoring to look at how species are changing, which species are doing better, which species are doing worse, what are the growth rates of these trees. We need to monitor, and it takes a commitment. And there are many cities on this list, they'd like to do the top 200 that aren't involved yet. Those are the ones that are grayed out more. But Ohio, we have Cleveland, and it looks like they'd like to do Cincinnati and Columbus. So if anybody's in those areas and wants to get monitoring going, I can hook you up. His name's Mark Majeski. You can talk and see. But the Forest Service only comes in if there's a partnership with the city. So it's a two-way street here. But we're trying to get more and more data on changes and permanent assessments going in for our cities at the time. If you do that, basically you close the loop of the management cycle through the upper left-hand side through monitoring. Because basically when you monitor, you're resetting the clock of data collection, and you can see what your forest is, let's say 5 years from now. And then you can see if you're moving in the right direction towards what you wanted that future state to be. If not, then you readjust the management plan. But we need the monitoring to know how our forests are changing. To me, that is so critical. Number 4, as we do our management planning, we need to link to human health and environmental quality. Air quality, water quality, air temperatures, UV radiation, human well-being. This is critical about trying to develop healthy forests. So why do we want the healthy forest? Because they produce health and well-being from the social and physical sides of the attributes of the forest. Sorry, there's another slide there. So we need to do that. So you can link into, EPA has regulations through the Clean Air and Clean Water Act, and possibly through climate change coming up, that if trees affect air and water quality, we need to link those processes, which is the next one. We need to link them to environmental regulations. We have the state implementation plans we need to do, potential for carbon credits, total maximum daily loads for water loads. Trees help influence the environment, and we need to tie it to the regulations. So we're not, urban forestry is not separate, saying, well, we're doing this for the trees, and it's a good thing over here on the right-hand side, but on the left-hand side, we have these environmental regulations that the cities and states have to deal with. We need to bridge those things across. State implementation plan is allowing forestry under voluntary and emerging measures for the Clean Air Act, but trees affect the environment, and therefore they affect the environmental regulations. We should try and link that across to the regulations so that not only are trees just a nice thing to do, they become, in essence, a regulated entity that we have to do because we put them in the regulations to improve clean air and clean water in the future. So basically, in this management cycle, when you develop a specific management plan, look at what the environmental regulations are for your area and how can trees influence that, and tie that into your future plans of how forestry can impact on things cities already have to do. Number 2, getting to the end here. Fortunately, this is the hardest one to explain. There's another economics lesson here. There's the whole argument for why we need public investments in trees. I'm trying to show you this. Hopefully you'll understand it. But there is an argument economically of why we should be investing public dollars into trees. And we need to get this message across. Trees produce what we call positive externalities. Externalities are basically costs or benefits that are not counted in the cost of the product. So there are negative externalities. Air pollution is a classic negative externality. Often not accounted for in the price of the product, but it produces, as we manufacture things, it produces air pollution, and it has a social cost to the environment because we're polluting the environment when we manufacture the product. Trees produce positive externalities. So how do we get this trees understood into this process of public investment? So here's the economics lessons, if you will. You have a marginal private cost, which is, that pointer again. That's the marginal private cost. And so as I manufacture something, let's say it produces pollution, the private cost stays the same, but the more I produce pollution. So therefore I have this marginal social cost that goes up as I produce more and more of the product, because that cost goes to society. So again, this is like the pollution curve, and this externality is not accounted for in the price of the product. So if you move across to the right-hand side here, what happens is if you have a demand curve, this is supply and demand, if we're right here, which is the marginal private cost, we tend to produce quantity Q at a price P because we're not accounting for the marginal social cost. If we force the manufacturer to account for the marginal social cost, we tend to slide to this point here, which means we tend to produce less of the product at a higher price because the manufacturer now has to account for the cost of the marginal pollution, or the marginal social cost in the production of that product. This is in essence why we have the EPA, because there's a market imbalance, if you will. The market does not allow for, it does not include the marginal social cost in the price of products. So the EPA forces regulations on, which in essence raise the price of the product and reduce its production. So the EPA role is doing this, forcing the manufacturer to account for the negative externality through environmental regulation so it doesn't pollute as much. Okay, understanding that about a negative externality, how does this affect forestry? Well, you flip it over. Forestry produces a positive externality. If I put trees out in the environment, it is cooling the environment, it's reducing pollution, it's improving water quality. All these positive attributes come from having more and more trees. So if there is no public investment or anybody regulating it, we tend to be right here. The marginal private cost, which is the cost we pay for the tree versus demand, we produce a quantity Q here and at price P, because we're not accounting for the positive externality, which is this yellow line. So if the trees produce a positive externality and it is forced to go in this direction, we tend to move here, which means if we accounted for the positive externalities of the trees in the price of the product would drop and the quantity would go up. So how do you do that? Because we are not accounting, just like we don't often account for the negative externalities, we're not accounting for the positive externalities. We are basically overpaying for the trees because we're not accounting for the positive benefits, and we're underproducing. So we need to produce more at a lower cost. So what we need to do, how do you do this? You can do this through either a carrot and stick approach. You incentivize it, which means this is why we need public investment, because it's a public good. If the public dollars went into it, the cost of the product would go down and people would plant it more. So basically we could have public investment in nurseries or public investments in subsidized nature, using the tax dollars to subsidize something that is a public good and have more forestry. You can do tax break for trees and maintenance. You can do special taxes. Some places actually have tree lotteries. The lottery money goes to tree planting. You can also enforce it if you wanted to go that way and not to be an incentive-based market, but an ordinance-based market. You shall have minimum tree planting regulations. We do this in various cases. We have ordinances to try to force market correction to have more trees to produce that public good. So we need more and more discussions on this of how do we get more public investment or more investments in things that produce positive externalities. And part about this is understanding what are the values provided by trees and getting that message out. The more people understand that, the more they're likely to invest in urban forest also. And lastly, number one, I think we need more coordination and integration. Urban forestry and urban forests touch so many other attributes about lives in urban society. We need to have more discussions, not within the urban forestry community, but amongst other groups that can influence urban forestry or use urban forests. So the political system, so that mayors and politicians understand the values, so they're more invested. Particularly the local governments for sustainability, LEED certification, US EPA, getting into education. I think that's very important. Our next generation of managers are the kids that are in school now, and the more they understand about the value of urban forests, the more they're likely to come in versed about it and not have to be educated about it, and will understand and more likely to support urban forests in the future. Crossing with city planners and among other urban forestry groups. We need to get out of our comfort zone of talking amongst ourselves to bridge across other groups. So in conclusion, the environment is changing. Research can help provide information and tools to help you get some of this information. Measurement, monitoring, integration, it's all planning, education are critical, and the actions that we have today will impact the urban forest of the future. And I thank you so much for your time. We only had a minor glitch on this one, which is appreciated. So I guess we have time for questions now if we want to go that way. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dave. You did a great job, and I wanted to personally thank you for being so great and calm during our technical difficulties.
Yeah, you're welcome. Glad it worked out okay.
Your presentations, we're recording this. Were a few questions in the question and answer box was, when will the presentations be available? They will be at the end of the full series, so sometime next month.
Also,
we will
Anybody
have
wants-
them available. Also,
Sorry, Woody, if anybody wants the presentations, david.nowak@usda.gov. I can mail you the PDF of these. This one or the one from before too.
that'd be great. I think we also put your website in the Q&A box so people can direct link that way. Thanks. So the presentations along with resources and websites will be on the evaluation email, which will be sent to you this afternoon to the address where you registered. So thank you so much. It's really important for you to fill out that evaluation. This is a new field for us. We were trying it out. So please take a moment and offer your constructive criticism so we can do better and better each time. I'd also like to say sorry for technical difficulties today, and we do promise to do better and be more prepared for these hiccups next week, and it will be better than ever next week. So I've been reviewing the questions. There's lots of here signed up for it yet. You can do that way. So we appreciate you being here. Can you give a reference for ideas on how to fund trees with increased Q?
With increased what?
Will that be on your website? Can you give a reference for your ideas on how to fund trees? Tree programs?
Oh yeah, no, actually I don't. Those
lottery
are, I mean, I'd heard about the lottery. We're actually working on a paper on that now, but we don't really have a reference to that. These are just ideas that I was throwing out. I think we have to have more discussions with people of how to do this. I mean, economically it says we should do this, and people don't think about it that way. We're trying to make an economic argument of why basically economics say we should be investing in this. But these are just ideas that I was throwing out to maybe move this forward.
Perfect. Another question is from Rita McKenzie. Dave, does the Forest Service work with weather channels locally and nationally to share with people that one of the reasons their community floods more than in the past is because of increased impervious surfaces? Seems that during a flood or large rain event would be a perfect time for a teachable moment demonstrating cause and effect with trees and so on.
Yeah, I don't know if we do. I've been on the Weather Channel once, but it was on a different topic. I don't know if we have a concerted effort to get on the Weather Channel. It is a good point. The fact of the matter is it's probably more impervious surfaces than trees. What we're finding from our research is impervious surfaces have a 10 to 12 times greater impact on water runoff than the trees do themselves, which means for every 1% impervious cover you put down in your area, you have to plant like 10 to 12% tree cover to offset that, because impervious is the biggest issue. Basically, if I could do anything, if I had a choice of
Dave, could you repeat yourself, please? You cut out there for a moment. Dave? You cut out there for a moment. Could you repeat yourself?
He may have lost connection again, but it should automatically reconnect him, so just give him a second.
So while we're waiting for Dave, I see a message here from Stephanie Miller, who is the urban forester in Northwest Ohio, that Coldwater has a really good tree lottery example. A couple people asked about tree lotteries. I can tell you Versailles also has a tree lottery program that's been around for a long time and works well. So those are our two examples in Ohio.
I am back. Sorry about that. I got booted off again.
It's all good. We just talked about a couple tree lottery examples here in Ohio to fill the time.
Yeah, the one I heard about, I think it was in Korea. I think it was Korea that had a tree lottery. So basically, you could do your scratch off, but the money went to instead of education, it went to trees.
Oh, nice. Did you want to repeat yourself from the question?
Yeah, what I was saying, I'm not sure I cut it out, but I think it was during the impervious. But basically, I was talking impervious. Impervious is, it's best to break up impervious before you plant trees. Not that trees won't have an impact, and they have multiple impacts on other services. But if you're trying to reduce the issue of this high runoff and water quality issues, it's best to break up or get that water diverted from the impervious surface into the soils. That was my point.
Great. Very good. Kristen Ramstead has a question. Is there any urban forest research addressing the changes in soil quality in urban areas and how these changes are affecting the quality of urban tree canopy, both now and in the future?
We've had people look at urban, Rich Puyat used to be a soils, he retired. Ian Esalonis is doing it somewhat. I'm not sure, and there are others, maybe Sharon Brock and a few others that might be looking. There are people looking at soils. I'm not that versed on it. I'm not sure what the latest research is on that. It's not that common, but there are a few people looking at that. I don't know if they're specifically looking at that question, but they're looking at soil environments in urban areas. It is an important question.
Great. Thank you. Another question is from Carol Polanski. Are you noticing red and sugar maples, especially older trees, are failing a bit more each year? If our climate is warming, should we be looking to plant more hybrid maples?
I haven't noticed if they're getting worse or not. That's where the monitoring data will help show that. And if I did see that, it might just, it'd be anecdotal in some ways. So that's where the importance of the monitoring is. We will be able to detect if certain trees are coming out faster than others. Whether it's a hybrid maple or that might work, I don't know if that'll do better, but there are lists from Lewis Iverson and Bill Hargrove that look at projected changes of the forest under future climate. I think we have some of that data, and we do have some of that data in iTree Landscape also, which trees are likely to do better or worse under future climates. So it might not just be a hybrid tree you need to plant, but may have to shift to another species that might be, I mean, if maples are on the fringe and are moving out, a hybrid might not help. It might be that you have to shift to another species. I don't know. It depends on where you're at in the context, but that's the hard question. At some point, if and when the climates change, when do we make that shift to the species? Do you do it now, or is it too soon? But if you wait too long, it's too late, because these trees take 50, 100 years, and they're a long-term proposition. That is a big area of research of which are the best trees and when we should start making that shift.
I know it's something that I've heard other speakers talk about is planting some of these other tree species into our urban forest as part of our diversity. What part of iTree has that information so our folks can look it up and play with it a bit?
Look up what specifically?
The transition, what's up and coming in iTree.
It's iTree Landscape.
Species are up and coming as.
Yeah, iTree Landscape, you go there and if you pick your area in landscape, one of the things are, in one of the tabs of the results will be species, and it'll have the list of the species that are native to your area that are going to be better or projected to be better or worse. It doesn't do all species. Obviously, it doesn't do a lot of invasive or exotic species. It's more the natural forest, because that makes the most sense that we have data on. So it is in that program.
Okay, so look in the iTree Landscape. Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, when you select your area and you process it through the results.
The results are there?
You have to go. We have to move a few tabs
that.
through to the results. You have to pick your area first, then you go to the results. It'll be in one of the tables.
Thank you. Michael Malampy asks, are native trees becoming less common as a percentage of urban forests? Is that something you know, or is part of your research?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, by default, yes, they would have to become less from, I mean, when you started the city originally, the native forest was all you had, so it was 100% native. So by default, as we urbanize, it has to become less through time, at least from the original starting point, because we're bringing in other plants from outside the area. So anytime you do that, the percent would have to go down. I guess the question now is it still going down? And are we shifting more and more to less, bad way to say it, are we having less native plants than we had in the past? That I do not know if we're still in that shift, because you have two things going on. It's what we plant, but it's also what's naturally regenerating. So if you have a natural forest system, you will tend to get a lot of natural regeneration. But you also have some invasive plants, and if you brought other plants in, let's say Norway maple in a certain area that tends to be invasive, you can get a lot of plants regenerating that are not native. So it tends to be on the context of where you're at. It's actually an interesting question to look at. That's where monitoring data will show. Are we tending to shift towards more or towards less native plants? I can't speak. I think it's site specific, but it is changing. I just don't know which direction it is, and that's what monitoring will help determine that.
Thank you. I just wanted to point out, for those of you who would like to know more about the Climate Change Atlas or iTree Landscape, Tyler has put those web links into the Q&A box to get you directly there right now if you want to take a look at it. We also have the link to register for next week's series. I have a couple more questions.
Sorry, I can say Leslie Brandt also has a Forest Service publication on. Sure.
Leslie Grant has a Forest Service publication on what?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, Leslie Brandt has a Forest Service publication on projections too, also that she was looking at, mainly for, I think, for the Chicago region, but that would have some information too.
Awesome. That will be very helpful. We'll try to get that information out to everyone as well. A few more questions. One from Bill Smith. How much impervious cover is due to buildings, and how much is hardscaping on the ground, like pavement and so on?
Ooh, excellent question. Offhand, I do not know. We could look that up because we have the data based by category. Bill, if you want to send me an email, I will look it up for you, david.nowak@usda.gov. But on average, about a third of our cities covered by impervious cover. I'm trying to guess at it. I think buildings are pretty important, but it would depend on the density of the city. As you tend to have more dense city, you tend to have higher impervious rates. So the ratio to roads to building might change versus a less dense network. As it becomes more dense, I think the ratio of buildings would go up to road. But I'd give you a wild guess here. I would say maybe it's about 50-50, but I'd have to look it up. I would have to analyze it. I don't know. 50-50 of that 33%, or third of the city.
Question about invasives, especially bush honeysuckle, which is a significant problem, I know, at least here in Southwest Ohio. How does that impact the impervious surfaces and versus trees? And John Tree asks, invasives such as honeysuckle should be removed only when native replacement follows removal, maybe, or is some green better than no green?
That is an excellent question. So we discussed this. Is that, I mean, invasive plants will provide services just by default because they have leaves out there. They're transpiring. They're sequestering carbon. But they have a cost associated with it in that if they're invasive, they might become more prevalent, which if you're okay with that, then I guess that's a good thing. But a lot of the studies show that the natural habitats of birds and animals are adapted more to the natural environment because that's what they're used to. And we start bringing these other plants in, maybe they'll facilitate, maybe some animals will adapt to the new plants, but for the most part, a lot of the insects and diseases, or insects don't feed on those plants, so the birds don't have the insects. So it has a long-term ripple effect, I guess, in some ways. So it will provide cooler air temperatures, it will provide all sorts of services, but at a potential cost versus having a different plant species there. So should you remove it? I think, I forgot who made the comment, but it'd probably be good to remove and replace it with something that's not invasive or exotic and just shift the composition to something that's not going to cause a future problem. But by leaving it there, it's still going to provide a service, but in the long run, it's going to cause probably some more problems than you didn't want to have in the first place.
Thank you. I always like hearing cutting down honeysuckle's good, but I get your point. Another question from Keith Mars. Cities are facing a multitude of challenges that we have real public policy and budget impacts. For example, affordable housing, social and racial justice, traffic congestion, people experiencing homelessness, all take up considerable bandwidth in the municipal world. How do cities make the case that urban forestry intersects with all these issues? Do you have an opinion on that?
Yeah, well, I think they intersect with, I don't know all of the issues, but most of the issues. But I think the hook into getting people to listen is relevancy. And the relevancy, I think, the most relevant attribute about the urban forest that would likely facilitate action is human health. And if we can make ties to trees improving health and well-being, so reducing stress, making the air cleaner, the water cleaner, cooler temperatures, especially with thermal stress, that's going to have a huge impact on healthcare costs. And someone suggested, I think they were from Yale, maybe Medicare should be paying for trees, because if trees can improve human health, it should be a social cost that should be paid for. It should be a prescription to have more trees, because everybody will benefit, well, most everybody around the trees will benefit by having cleaner air and cooler temperatures. So I think that some of these arguments might be on the fringe, but the main core argument would be human health and well-being, things that are relevant, and safety of populations and things like this. And it's not about that they're just nice to have around and they look good, which they do. It's about they are relevant and they impact my life and reduce my cost by reducing energy, reduce my healthcare costs because they make me healthier. I will live longer. If people make that connection, you then have an avenue for policies to be directed to help doing that. Understanding there are some negative attributes about the trees, which are also important to take into account, such as pollen and things like that. But overall, the evidence is that trees are positive to human health, and start having a discussion and getting into the planning of how best to design our landscape with trees to affect the most people, the underserved people, so that we can improve human health and well-being throughout our cities.
Great answer. A follow-up to that is I found that local examples are more powerful than a big city somewhere else. What part of iTree could we use to show these sort of benefits in our own community? What part of iTree could we use?
Yeah, I agree with that 100%, because my original work 30 years ago, we started in Chicago, the Chicago Climate Project, everybody was citing that, but you have to have local data. You can't, Chicago can't answer every question. There are several tools depending what you want to do. The core tool is iTree Eco, which you would put your inventory in or sampling data. It takes field data, so it takes some work. The simplest tools would be Landscape, where you could just click on a map and we'll give you estimates. They're fairly broad. A better approach, which is still simple, is using iTree Canopy and just photo interpret the area that you want, and we will give you estimates for certain values for that area. Those are the two simplest tools. At the small scale, you could go to MyTree, which is a phone app, which can do individual trees, or Design, which does a group of trees around a house. That's more for kids and small scale things. But if you want to do a large area, the cheapest and reasonable estimate, broad scale, is Landscape or Canopy. The most accurate estimate would be using Eco, which again involves field data, and you can actually project those populations in the future and do simulations. Say, what if Emerald Ash Borer came through? What would happen to my population? But that requires those field data, and it'll take you right through. It'll tell you where to go to collect the data, sets it all up for you. It's pretty easy to use, but it does take a commitment because you have to go sample and collect the data. With Canopy and Landscape, you don't have to do anything. Canopy, you just have to photo interpret your image.
And you quickly mentioned an app there. It's called MyTree. MyTree,
yeah, it's a phone app. Basically, it's very simple, like two or three pages. You say what species you have, what size, it knows where you're at, and it'll estimate services for that tree.
Nice. I haven't played with that one yet. I'll have to put it on my list. Another question from Tom Davis. Can we utilize the impervious surfaces to sustain tree plantings? Is there a way that we can take advantage of them?
Wow, the only way I could see that, I have to think about that question, is green roofs. The problem with the impervious, I mean, you can, with rain gardens, you can run the impervious runoff into swales and create areas that would water trees, except it'll probably be warmer temperatures because the water tends to heat up over the impervious surfaces. You can create green, like I said, green roofs on top of there, but in most cases, trees over impervious are good because it will reduce the water hitting the impervious. Trees in impervious, outside of maybe parking lots would be another area. You could break up parking lots and put more trees in, but there's a cost. If you break up the parking lot, there will be less spaces for parking, obviously, and you can't plant in the middle of a roadway because cars have to pass. So there's sort of counterbalance each other in that areas that where we want impervious surfaces. Usually a reason why we have it there. It's usually for transportation or residences. So it's hard to put a tree there because trees limit transportation. So they fight each other in some ways, but they can go together somewhat in certain areas.
Great. Franklin Brackman asked you if you could make a better definition for impervious surface. Like, could you explain it a little bit more for maybe someone new to the concept?
I'm sorry, you broke up a little bit there. Could you repeat it, please?
Did I lose you? Sure, I'm sorry. Franklin Brackman would like you to define impervious surface. Maybe a definition that someone new to the word could use or understand better.
Yes. Yeah, it's a good question. Sorry about that. That's my bias. Impervious surfaces are any surface that's impervious for water movement going through it. So cement, tar, buildings, we tend to seal those because we don't want the water to go through it. It tends to run off the surface. So pervious surfaces are surfaces that allow water to penetrate. So soil is a pervious surface. You can have pervious sidewalks and pervious roadways with those new layers of those permeable surfaces. So not all roads and sidewalks are necessarily impervious, but most are because we tend to put tar and concrete down. And the issue is it doesn't allow the water to move through it, so it runs off into a pipe, and then all that water concentrates. And so when you have a storm, all that water is concentrated in the pipes and tends to flush out. So we want pervious surfaces to allow the water to penetrate into the soil.
Great. Sally Parsons was wondering where she can find the data to illustrate the 10 to 12 times increase in flooding that 1% increase in impervious surface will cause. Is that on your, is that one of your studies on your website?
Yes.
Okay.
Send me an email. I'll have to find that paper. We have it in some, and it's more, a lot of it's just from the studies we've been doing. They're not all published, but we do have studies that show the relationship of trees and impervious, and it changes. Sometimes it's 8, sometimes it's 14. Depends on the conditions, but we do have it in certain papers, and I just off the hand I don't know which paper it is.
We have some folks here from out of state, so I don't know all these folks, but this one's from Wilmington, Delaware. Vikram Krishnamurthy. Dave, on the topic of tree canopy goals and sustained efforts, would you say that establishing a longer time frame for a canopy goal is more likely than to support a sustained effort rather than one-time influx?
I think the answer to that is yes, if I understand the question right. Yeah, trees take a long time, but the key thing about sustainability is basically if you had a constant influx of trees per year and a constant removal, which the removal rates are outside of storms, you have a certain rate, maybe it's 2% of the trees are being lost per year, and some regeneration's coming in and some plantings going in. If they were stable through time, you would create a canopy. It would stay fairly stable at a certain percent. It would fluctuate a very little bit. The problem is if you overplant or underplant, you will get either a bubble or a trough in the population which will cause the canopy to go up or down, and then eventually the issue. I mean, tree planting is good, and you can, in theory, overplant. You can have too many trees where you overpack and these trees get big and you have to thin them out, or they'll all get old together. So if you put your, I guess if you had a constant flux, if you're going to plant a million trees, it's probably better to spread that out over many years than trying to do it in too short of a period. It would help stabilize the cover.
Age diversity, yes, is that the idea?
That will give you age diversity too, yes. What you're creating is basically, like I said before, like a baby boom. If you put too many in, that you have many trees in one age class. They're all going to grow old together and get senile, so you're going to have to take care of them. And then they're all going to go out in a fairly short period of time. So the canopy will go up for a while, and then it'll drop rather rapidly. That's what you're trying to avoid, these rapid drops.
Perfect. Thank you. James Brown asked, Dave listed capital L, capital T, capital E, capital R on a slide. What is it? Not sure which slide he's mentioning.
Capital L, capital E. Oh, LEED.
Capital T,
LEED.
capital E.
Yeah, LEED certification. That's a who runs that program? Is it EPA or somebody? It's a certification process where they certify energy conservation things to landscapes and buildings. You can
Scott
Google
Lucas
it. I'm not sure. We've talked to people that LEED more about landscapes.
Okay. Is there a list of native trees that are being affected most by climate change? Does that depend on where you are in the country, I presume?
The answer is yes. It would depend upon where you are in the country, and that list would be either Lewis Iverson has lists, if you Google his name, or Bill Hargrove has a list, and we put Hargrove's list in iTree Landscape. So those are the native trees, and it'll tell you which is projected to do better or worse under future climates. And it does vary by where you are in the United States.
Oh, Allison Bush helped us out. The acronym is Long-Term Ecological Research Network.
Oh, that one, LTER. Sorry, oh, that was the lead one. LTER is a National Science Foundation project where they fund long-term research. So Hubbard Brook and other places where they monitor forests for a long period of time. About 20 years ago, they started doing urban areas. So and Baltimore was selected, and Phoenix. So there's 2 urban LTERs where because they're long-term, they have long-term data. And so they're doing monitoring of certain areas. So they're NSF programs. But I believe there's only 2 urban ones out there right now, Baltimore and Phoenix.
I'm going to ask this question from Beverly Bingle, but I have a personal investment in it too, because I have a project as well. Please say more about letting natural restore land bank properties, vacant lots, and are there cities that have done this? Does it make an impact on the data to have these vacant lots reforested?
Well, the answer would be the answer would be yes. Reforesting vacant lots. I mean, if you don't do anything to the vacant lot, the lake, depending where you are, the vacant lot will probably reforest itself with shrubs and things going in. But it will have an impact. I mean, at the local scale, definitely when you're around those vacant lots, because it'll produce the services and all sorts of services, social and environmental, for that neighborhood. At the large scale, will have an impact. It would depend on how many vacant lots you actually convert. So obviously, the more conversion from a grass to a forested stand, the greater the impact on the overall city. But so it's hard to say. It depends how many lots you have. But yeah, foresting those lots will create more environmental services and social services, particularly for people in that area.
Great. That's great news for me too. One very last question, as we're just a minute or so from noon. David Carey has asked, have tree benefits valuations changed in iTree over the last 10 years or so? How benefits minus costs are calculated, that sort of thing.
The benefits have changed. Sorry?
Yes, how have the benefits changed?
Yeah. The benefits have changed, and we've added some new ones. We've put UV radiation in, and we're working on air temperatures in human health right now. So we're constantly adding new ones in. Some of the old ones do change slightly through time as we get better algorithms or more algorithms, like on carbon storage. We've added PM 2.5 in the last 5 or 10 years. So we're constantly adding new services in, and some of the valuation does change. Was there another part of that question?
Nope. That's
Oh.
how benefits minus costs are calculated.
Oh, yeah, the cost side. We tend to do some of the environmental costs, like there'll be a negative cost to energy conservation sometimes in the winter. We take care of that. We are working on pollen right now. We have a paper on that. We actually have a new one on wood products too. But in terms of costs, we don't do much on costs because we rely on you to supply the cost side, so we don't know your costs. So in ECO, you can add your costs in, and it'll do a ratio of the benefits that we know, which are conservative, so we can't do all the benefits, to your costs. So we actually don't bring in the costs because they're so site-specific. But we allow you to bring them in if you want.
Perfect. Well, we have hit noon. I just wanted to thank you so very much for your time and energy today. As always, I learned something new and am inspired by all these new concepts and new things. So thank you very much for sharing it with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Sorry for all the glitches here, but I appreciate the opportunity to talk to everybody.
Thank you.
All right, thanks.
Bye, Dave. I wish we could all applaud, but yeah.
I wouldn't hear it anyway, the way the
All right,
computer's
thank
working.
you,
So.
Gary.
Thanks.
Have a good rest of your day, and take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.